So, our special guest today is Andrew Najberg. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Andrew, and how you got started in writing?
Well, currently I teach for the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. I've been working there full time for 18 years, teach courses in creative writing, usually poetry workshops, fiction workshops, and survey courses. I also have a specialty in Japanese horror and magical realism. I got an MFA from Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky, and an MA in English with a writing concentration from University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I've been writing pretty much my whole life. I grew up in a bit of a chaotic household, and I found myself spending a good bit of time either by myself or with my sister, and in both cases, really needed things to fill the time, and storytelling became one of the main things I'd do. Honestly, I would walk around my neighborhood, ride my bike, and I'd just tell stories in my head. Eventually, my sister actually also wanted to write, and she actually started to force me to write for quite a while when I was in, I don't know, third or fourth grade or so, and it just kind of stuck from there.
Yeah. Did your sister become published in the end? Is that something she carried on with?
No, she ended up going very different routes. She ended up being a board certified emergency room physician. And she did have a presence on TikTok for some time, especially during the pandemic. She worked to spread health news. So she is a bit of a creator in a sense, but yeah, very different route.
Very different. So what actually drew you to the horror genre specifically?
So I think there's kind of two things. One, to me, horror is actually a comfort genre. My mom in particular was a huge fan of 50s and 60s horror. And so even now I have a pretty big catalog of old classics like Them, The Blob, The Terror from Beyond Space, all those kind of Roger Corman classics, that kind of stuff. So I do have a lot of positive memories growing up watching these, old horror films with the family. But then also, I think horror has a lot of freedom to explore character in a way that isn't always present in some of the other genres, in that I think horror has a huge range of emotions and flaws that it's able to pursue, which may be more difficult to really get into in, a more traditional genre, or even, something like fantasy or something like that. You're allowed, I think, to transgress in ways with your characters that give you a certain freedom for creation that I think is really fascinating. And I think at the same time, because you are looking at some of the more challenging aspects of people and what it means to be a person, it also lets you tackle some very serious subjects as well.
Yeah. There doesn't seem to be a limit in the horror genre. You can literally write whatever you want to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, there's that way in which every decision you make as an author is going to lean towards some audiences and perhaps alienate some others. But, you look at the current market for extreme horror, for example, and I mean, you definitely get the sense that, the envelope may have some limits before it tears, but man, they're really far away sometimes.
Yeah. So what's the first horror story that you've ever wrote?
Oh, that I've ever wrote. So that's going to be, it's sort of tough to define in a way, because it's going to depend on what you consider to fall under the horror genre. So I've been writing fiction for quite some time. And the first real attempt I made at a novel was, I don't know, started around 2012, I think. And it was a failed attempt. I'm never going to let that book see the light of day, but it did have major horror elements. I viewed it more as a horror, perhaps more of an adventure story with, very dark elements to it. But no, from the publishing standpoint, things that I've actually managed to bring out into the world, I started publishing short fiction around 2021. And some of the first pieces I put out were kind of a hybrid between science fiction, horror, and magical realism. And so, I have one piece that is it's actually just a simple little narrative that's largely in some ways told through the point of view of a lamp and a bench that witness a nuclear Armageddon. But it definitely has imagery that would be consistent with the horror genre. Another of my earlier fictional pieces that got put out was through a place called Prose Online, and it's called Where We Leave Ourselves. And that's a short story that takes place in a slightly alternate reality where people molt like cicadas as they age. And it's absolutely loaded with grotesque imagery. In terms of what I've written that most squarely and traditionally falls into the kind of the most common definition of horror, I have a handful of short stories that have appeared in a number of magazines and podcasts. A couple of the most distinct ones were on Creepy Podcast, had a story called The Dead All Look Like Children, about a man who was haunted by the childish ghosts of his parents. But then in terms of my larger publications, The Mobius Store is my first, my debut novel. And that's a pretty squarely traditional horror piece, small town cosmic horror.
Do you write in any other genres, or are you just basically horror?
No, actually, I would definitely view myself every bit as much of a science fiction author as I am horror. I also do actually publish quite a bit of poetry. I have about a 20-year publication record in poetry, a lot of different magazines, ranging from North American Review, another Chicago magazine, Nashville Review. I won the AWP Intro Award in that. But no, my current novel, the one that I'm kind of marketing right now, comes out November 24th. It's called Gollitok, and it's I'd say it's about 60% science fiction, 40% horror. So it's set in a post-apocalyptic future. It actually rests a lot of the horror on scientific principles. Even Mobius Store has a science fiction thread that runs through the core of it.
Yeah. So which genre do you prefer the most?
Oh, that's a really tough one. That's kind of like putting somebody in, a room with all their kids and saying, which one do you like best? So... I think I write them for different reasons, though. Even the books that combine genres, I'm working on a novel right now that is set in orbit, and I like to describe it as either The Deep in Space or Event Horizon meets The Martian. And it's got some very distinctive horror passages and a lot of hard science fiction. And when I'm working on it, though, one thing I definitely find is that sometimes I am much more interested in pursuing the science side of the narrative, exploring things like, what's it like to travel, to live in orbit, to travel in space. And then on other days, I really want to lean into those horror elements and think about, the darker aspects of these characters and their situation. And it's not something I could say that one is better for me or the other. It's more they suit different parts of my personality.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you come up with your ideas?
So I read a lot. That's going to be the single best source for it. I mean, I read a lot. I watch a lot of TV, especially movies and and shows within genre. I actually don't just read fiction, though. I read a lot of nonfiction. I do. I spend a good bit of time reading things like academic journals. I've been a big fan of astronomy since I was a kid, and I actually spent a few years as a computer science major in college. And so I like to read a lot of the magazines that are putting out studies, especially things that are kind of frontline and speculative in nature. So, I'll read things about predictions about, Hawking radiation, if I see that as a title, or I'll, look at something that talks about, dimensional gaps in quantum foam or something along those lines. And really, it's just a question of trying to build a lot of information that I can start to pull from when I start thinking about premises. But then I read a lot of stories too, because I want to learn how to structure things, how to develop characters, to see how other people have tackled similar problems.
Yeah. So how do you go about creating your characters?
So that's one of those things that I have to say I always take a couple very basic and simple approaches to. I teach creative writing classes, and that's one of those things that I kind of drive home with my students over and over and over is having, recognizable characters, people whose motivations we're going to understand and be able to identify. And so as I start working on a scene, it's hard to say what exactly is going to lead me into a piece. So, I might have just read an article that was really interesting, or I may want to put a story in a specific setting, or maybe I just have like an image in mind of two characters in some sort of conflict with each other. It's hard to predict, but one of the earliest things that I do as I start to make the scene take shape is I stop and I take stock of the characters and ask the really direct question: what do these characters want? What do they want overall? What do they want in this scene? And I generally find if I can't answer those things, I find it pretty hard to proceed further for more than a couple of pages. That if I don't know what's driving the characters, I don't know how the characters are going to act or react to what's in front of them. And as a result, I also can't decide what happens next. Because I do think that character agency is a really crucial driver of what makes good fiction work. If your characters are passive and simply responding to changing circumstances, I mean, sure, you can have a really cool premise that drives that forward for a while, but I also think that people want to see the characters that they're investing their emotions in doing things and acting and seeing the consequences of those actions. That's where our emotional weight comes in. And one other thing I do in the process is I do like to rest a lot of my stories on fairly fundamental human relationships. Like I love writing parent and child relationships. And sometimes I write father-son or father-daughter, sometimes mother-son, mother-daughter. It's not necessarily important, the genders of the relationships, but I love exploring that dynamic. I love exploring the relationship between siblings. I kind of had my own universe with my own sister. And so that's something that I have a lot of fun playing around with. But I find that if you rest a major conflict of the story on, a very recognizable connection like that, most readers are going to be able to engage with it pretty well.
Yeah. So have you ever based any characters off people that you know or from personal experience?
So loosely, one thing I do always try to follow, and it's advice I love to give in general, but I find that as an author, the story often starts to teach me how to write it once I start putting elements on the page. You start with that blank page, and everything that you populated with it begins constraining and steering what's going to happen next, what's going to be coherent and cohesive with that world. But that being said, I definitely know that some of my best work is definitely drawn from or reflected direct relationships that I have. So, I'll give just two quick examples. I had a kind of a speculative or magical realism piece come out in the magazine Fusion Fragment just a couple months ago, and I'm really, really proud of this piece. But it's basically about a father whose son. The mother died during childbirth, and so he's been raising his son all alone. And his son vanishes over the course of each day, and the only way to restore him so that he doesn't disappear altogether is for the father to sacrifice a week of his life each day. Yeah. And the story is, in a lot of ways, written about my, raising my son. Basically, that it's hard not to feel as a parent like you're always just giving parts of yourself. And I mean in a positive way, too. I don't mean this to sound like harsh or horrifying. But, you definitely have those days where you feel just absolutely exhausted, but you still have to kind of keep going and keep being there. And so, that kind of thinking about the challenges of, raising somebody for their whole lives was definitely a driver behind that story. And then in the Mobius story, two of the main characters are two siblings, Stuart and Micah, and their relationship throughout the piece is very much driven by my relationship with my sister. There's a couple of my favorite passages out of that book that very directly reflect childhood memories.
Yeah. So what's been the most difficult story or scene that you've ever had to write?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So story-wise, if you mean the most like challenging to get down on the page,
Yeah.
I'll definitely say the one infusion fragment actually was one of them, because one thing I didn't mention as part of that story was a reaction to a very troubling incident that had occurred surrounding our family and our school, actually. And so part of the impetus behind writing that story was my belief in my ability to protect my children was severely shaken. And so a good chunk of that piece was written as a very direct expression of my discomfort and trauma at that realization.
Yeah.
But so yeah, that piece was exceptionally emotionally challenging to put down. From a craft point of view, the Mobius door was a tremendously difficult process. It has a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of characters and points of view that I had to make sure were lining up, because the whole story takes place in a single evening. And so I had to make sure I was always keeping track of where all of the other characters were in relation to each other. So from the planning standpoint, that one was definitely a huge challenge. But yeah, this story is called Before You Fade Away from Fusion Fragments. Probably the hardest thing I've ever written.
Brilliant. So would you consider yourself a plotter or a pantser?
Almost 100% pantser. I do some plotting in that, like when I'm working on a longer piece in particular, so either a short story over like 15 pages or a novel, I have some goalposts that I'm writing towards. Like when I wrote Gollitok, one thing that I knew was that the characters had a couple of key milestones that had to happen in their journey for a core plot to happen. But other than that, I literally sat down and I wrote that book beginning to end. I maybe jumped back to review a segment to make sure I had some consistency of details, but that one really was written just with a bullet point outline that maybe had 8 or 10 different points on it, and then all of the rest was completely invented as I moved forward. Mobius was actually strangely similar, but that also did teach me a lesson in why I should maybe think about doing a bit more planning. That book, its initial draft ended up at around, 540 pages. And the ending just didn't work at all. And it was because I didn't think I managed to pull together couple major plot threads successfully. And in the major revision I did, I ended up cutting about 250 pages of material, including 4 main characters. And I radically revised that novel with a plan in mind, having learned from that initial pantsed draft. But then, the newest book that I'm working on, I tried to strike a middle ground between, but about 200 pages of it after that first 100 pages where there was some planning, the pages 100 to about 320 were written pretty much just straightforward, one page after another, simply knowing what comes next.
Do you find you have to take more notes when you're doing it that way?
So I don't take a whole lot of notes, actually, because I find that it's damaging for my voice as an author. Basically, the notes always end up being out of sync with the notes I take, say, 3 months in. But what I do is I do jot down kind of skeletal fragments, but then I talk through my stories. I have a 45-minute commute to and from work. And so one of the ways I use that commute is I literally just dictate to myself scenes and practice iterations so that when I sit down and write, the material of the scene is ingrained in my natural voice, that I'm not referring to notes. I'm not trying to fit or bridge from one thing to the other. It's able to come out in a fairly solid form.
That's a good way of doing it, to be fair.
It's worked so far. Hopefully it keeps up that way. I'm definitely a writer who I'm a pacer, and I talk to myself that if we wanted to have the pantser planner, like I would maybe put pacer in there, which is this weird hybrid between the two, because you are kind of planning things, but not exactly. But that'd probably be the best way to describe it. Like if nobody's home, like on the days where the kids are at school, my wife's at work, and I'm not teaching, I literally will pace around my living room, pace up and down the hall, and just talk these things through to myself, and then sit down at the keyboard when I feel like I'm ready to actually hammer something out.
Yeah, we'll have to check that one at the debates and see whether anything comes back. Okay, so what's your most popular book, and how do you think it's resonated with your readers?
So definitely so far, the Mobius definitely in terms of sales has been honestly more successful than I thought it would be. And it's not that I didn't have a lot of faith in the book. I mean, I'm proud of my work, but I did come into fiction out of writing poetry, and poetry, readers are really interesting because they really do embrace your work. I mean, I've gotten some beautiful letters from people who have read some of my poems, and you do build this really intense connection sometimes because of the kinds of stuff you're putting into the work and the attention that readers pay to the detail and so on. But unfortunately, though, you don't have the breadth of audience in poetry, and so my poetry collection, I don't know, it sold like 200 copies or something like that, and it's been out for 2.5 years now. And, I bring some copies with me to events, but, they don't move nearly as fast as, as a horror book. And so kind of coming out the gate, literally my pre-sales, I think, outnumbered the amount of books I've sold of the poetry collection, in its whole life. So, that's definitely part of it. But I think people have received it pretty well, because it is a story that has a lot of points of view. I actually knew from the beginning that from reading other reviews and seeing what people say about similar stories, I did know there would be a percentage of the audience that probably wouldn't be a big fan of the point of view switching. But that is one thing I noticed in some of the reviews I've read, that the people who weren't as fond of the book flagged that. But otherwise, I mean, I've gotten a lot of really good response. I've had some people tell me it's one of their favorite books of all time, or it was one of the best books they've read this year. I've had people tell me how much they love specific characters and how they could identify with them. I've got a lot of really good notice. Actually, there's a single chapter in the book. The book has 9 main chapters. In between, though, there's these little sections I called interims, which focus explicitly on developing the history of the two brothers, Stuart and Micah. And there's one of them that's called The Lord of Worms. And it's actually my favorite passage in the whole book, because it's a translation of childhood memory between me and my sister into the book's context. And I've had a lot of people tell me that was their favorite scene out of it, which was just wonderful because, even though I had only kind of written that as sort of a nod to my sister, and because I thought it was a fun memory, it was great to see that actually resonating with people outside the actual horror book itself. But then I have a new book coming out. Gollitok's been on pre-sale for a couple months now, and it's been on NetGalley getting readers and ratings on there and on Goodreads. And I will say the response has been tremendously positive. I've been extremely happy with the advanced reviews I'm getting. And so I honestly have a hunch that while I'm extraordinarily proud of and gratified by how well the Mobius store did, I think that Gollitok may actually end up beating it.
Fantastic. That sounds like it's going to do really well when it actually comes out properly.
Yeah, it's the waiting game, isn't it? Though, it's one thing that you learn pretty quickly. Trying to publish things. Even when I was just putting out poems in magazines, I mean, the wait time between composition and sending it out, and then first off waiting for either a rejection or acceptance, and then let's say it's an acceptance, then you have that wait time between when it actually either goes to print or to screen, and you find yourself just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, and
yeah,
it's hard not to be super excited, but at the same time, it can also be excruciating. So the Mobius story came out on April 28th, and I'm actually looking forward to November 21st when the audiobook release comes. It's been something that's been in talks for a good chunk of time since the initial publication. But yeah, you have to wait. You've got the book out, but then suddenly you have to wait for narrators to audition. You have to wait for the whole recording process. And yeah, it's amazing what an exercise in patience so much of this stuff is.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a long time, isn't it, really, with some of the things that we have to do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could spend 2 years waiting for a publication to come out. In fact, actually, Gollitok was accepted for publication before the Mobius store was. Now 6 months later, I'm just now finally going to be seeing Gollitok come into print. Now, in all fairness, I did actually change publishers with that book midway through the process because I was extraordinarily happy with just how well Wicked House had done with Mobius store. Literally, I don't think I could have asked for more from a press, and it was such a delightful experience that when I compared it to the process I was feeling through the other press, I really just felt that there was no comparison. And so, that delay was partially caused by me, but even then that press was already running slower. And so, I ended up with the book being accepted last June. And now here it is, November 23, and it's about to come out, a year and a half later.
But at least it's coming out. That's the main thing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I literally couldn't possibly be happier. I've had the weird fortune of having 3 novels accepted for publication within a year. I have a young adult book coming out in January too, through Olive Ridley Press. That one's called The Neverborn Thief, which that one I call a young adult dark fantasy. It's got a lot of horror stuff, but it's set in a kind of a different world, and so fantasy tends to be the best descriptor for it.
Well, fantastic. I mean, congratulations on three of them being accepted. That's amazing.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's funny because the young adult book that is getting published was the first of the 3 that I wrote, and so it was really strange. That one I'd been sending out for some time, and it had gotten positive feedback from agents and almost taken by a couple of them, almost taken by a couple small presses. And, that one I was actually almost tempted to shelve it. And then, when you get that kind of barrage of positive news, one thing that is really strange, and I've talked to a lot of writers about this, is that you start to get a little bit of a disconnect from the way news should feel, where you read the acceptance email in your inbox and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then, 6 hours later at the end of your evening, you just kind of casually open up your email to see if there's any more rejections or acceptances. The way that, we tend to have to work by kind of almost carpet bombing the industry with our submissions. You kind of get into this mechanical routine of checking for rejections or possible acceptances. And it has this very odd effect on how you feel about the news you actually do get.
Yeah, I suppose if you're expecting rejection all the time, then that one acceptance, you don't really know how to feel, do you?
Exactly. And then a couple of things come in at once and you suddenly realize it's like, well, I just celebrated one book. What do I do about the second one? Um,
Okay, so have you had any memorable reactions from your readers? Any that particularly stand out to you?
so of course, definitely a couple that were really cool. Like I said, when I first started writing poetry, one thing that did surprise me was a couple of the letters I got in response to poems I published. So the very first piece of what I'd call fan mail, I got all the way back in like 2008, and I'd published a poem in North American Review about my visit to the Body Farm. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Body Farm, but it's just on the outskirts of University of Tennessee Knoxville, and it's part of their forensics program. And
Yeah.
basically, what they do is they lay out corpses to study the various different effects of weather on their decomposition. And I went there when I was 17 and wrote about it when I was like maybe 22. And it's still to this day one of my favorite single pieces I've written. But yeah, it was the strangest feeling to have somebody write me out of the blue. I never really expected anybody to take notice of it because it was just a magazine publication. But no, over time, one of the coolest things about having a book get a little bit of notice is I've built some really cool relationships as a result of people's reactions to it. So one of the best examples is somebody who's quickly become one of my absolute favorite contemporary authors is this fella named John Kahn. He published a book called Slash Tag that came out 2 days before Mobius did. And one of the only reasons it even kind of came on my radar to begin with was when I was kind of keeping an eye on the new release charts on Amazon when the book was released. His was right next to mine, and like we kind of passed each other a couple times
Yeah.
during that opening stretch. And so I was like, I wonder what that book's about. And then, a little while later, I came across him saying some really positive things about Mobius in one of the online groups, and I ended up responding to him, and had a really positive conversation about it, and I ended up deciding to buy Slash Tag, which it's an outstanding book. I think it's just fabulous, and since then, we've gotten in touch we've gotten in touch with each other a couple of times about just various different writing concerns, and we ended up reading each other's ARCs for both of our respective forthcoming books. And so he read Gollitok, and I read his new book, Everything is Temporary. And yeah, we've just, he's going to be joining a reading series that I'm running down the road. And so, you actually build real connections with people just based on, a shared love of horror writing and sort of overlapping interests. And that's been pretty cool. But then also, you can't help but to enjoy some of the critical responses as well. I think everybody sort of takes pride in exacting what a truly negative review. I've seen lots of horror writers like Duncan Ralston and folk like that post some of the really amusing negative things people have said over time. And I think I think there's a certain degree to which anytime you elicit a really strong reaction in any direction, I think there's a part of the writer in you that just chalks that up as a success, regardless of what they say.
That's right. I mean, I've seen some of the reviews that have been posted on Facebook. Some of them are quite hilarious. Obviously, the readers don't particularly read the blurbs because obviously some of the stuff that they're reading is, if it's making them that sick, then obviously they shouldn't be reading that genre in the first place.
Yeah, you can't help but wonder sometimes about their method for choosing books. So some of my favorites have been the reactions people posted to Aaron Beauregard's Playground, simply because, I don't know how somebody could possibly look at the cover of that book and read its synopsis and think, oh, this looks like a pleasant read.
Definitely. Okay, so Are there any other existing projects that you're currently working on that you can actually share with us?
Yeah, I do have a couple things. One, I'm in the late editing stages of a collection of short stories that's coming out through Crystal Lake Publishing in November of 24. That's been extremely exciting. That kind of developed organically just out of the process of publishing a lot of short fiction and being in ongoing communication with Wicked House. Ended up building a relationship with a couple folk at Crystal Lake Publishing, because Wicked House really don't do short fiction, and so they kind of were looking at they kind of helped me poke around to find a good home for the collection. But I'm really excited about that one because it's a mix that I think really showcases a lot of the different kinds of creativity I like to explore. It's a lot of science fiction, some of it hard sci-fi, some of it softer. There's definitely some horror narratives in there, handful of magical realism stories. So that's one I'm really, really looking forward to getting out there. Then I'm also looking forward to the cover reveal of The Neverborn Thief. I'm expecting actually a new draft of that, the cover for that, to come any day now. So that's one I've been really excited for because it's radically different than my more traditional horror books, Mobius and Gollitok. Like, as a writer with kids, and specifically as a horror writer with kids, I'm really looking forward to having a book that I can share with my kids that I think that they'll be able to read and enjoy. And then finally, I've got a new novel called Extinction Dream, and I just completed the primary drafting. I have a decent bit of revision to do. I have one chapter I need to add into an earlier part of the story, but most of it's going to be language, style, and that kind of thing, and maybe a little bit of character tweaking for consistency. But I'm hoping to be able to start submitting that book to publishers, including, of course, Wicked House, and probably by around Christmas. So, I'm hoping before early 2024 to be able to make an announcement about that one soon as well. I try to keep myself pretty busy overall. Oh, and finally, I do want to mention that I am doing a live horror reading series. Anybody who's interested can follow me on Facebook, either at my personal account of Andrew Najberg or Andrew Najberg at author, or Andrew Najberg author. But we just had our inaugural event, a reading with myself, and the authors Blaine Daigle and William Gray. Blaine's the author of The Broken Places and A Dark Rue, and William Gray's book, The Devil Within Us All, came out just a couple months ago. I've got a second event in November with myself and Will Gray, and then also Andrew Van Way, author of Head Like a Hole, is going to be joining us. And got a January event with John Kahn, Duncan Ralston, and Jeff Strand, and a December event with Joe Scipione, Megan Stockton, and Justin Hawley. So 4 events are guaranteed at this point. A 5th one's already coming together. And, beyond that, if people are interested, they'll continue on to the foreseeable future.
That's fantastic. That sounds like you've got a lot going on in the next year. But the next year.
Oh, I'm doing my best. Trying to keep your name out there, trying to keep your work visibility and the work of others visible. That's so much of the battle at this point. And one thing that's been awesome is, when Mobius came out, I wasn't too familiar with the indie publishing industry. I had some encounters with it, but really more with smaller names that were not really even smaller names. Names like Grady Hendrix, Nick Cutter, S.A. Barnes. People who had substantial publishers behind them. But then when I had conversations about their books, people would mention all of these other books that I wasn't quite familiar with. And so when it came time to really start promoting Mobius, my publisher recommended a bunch of groups I could look at. And, I started joining them, and it was amazing to discover just how many incredible authors are producing material right now. That's how I found Andrew Van Way, who's one of my favorite authors at this point. John Kahn, he's what I call an auto-buy author, where I'll just buy everything he publishes right now. Duncan Ralston, of course, has been fabulous, and he's absolutely hilarious to interact with. MJ Marr is the author of The Suffering. She's both a fabulous author and a delightful writer. So yeah, it's just, meeting all of these cool people and discovering all of these incredible books has just been one of the single best parts of this whole process and journey.
That's brilliant. So where can the readers find your books? I know you mentioned a couple of places. Is there anywhere else?
Well, so, Wicked House distributes through Amazon and, Kindle Direct Publishing. And they also do the extended distribution, which also links to Ingram Sparks. And so certainly the easiest way to get the stuff is through Amazon, but you can order through Barnes & Noble, through almost any bookstore, actually. A number of folk have ordered them through their public libraries. The audiobooks will be available through Amazon and a couple other platforms shortly. So basically, really the short answer is anywhere books are sold.
Okay, that's fantastic. So you're basically everywhere.
That's the goal, at least. Now, I will mention the one book I've been talking about a decent bit, Gollitok, is still only for pre-sale. So if you want a copy of that, you would have to pre-order it through Amazon. On November 24th, the print order will open up on Amazon and all other vendors.
That's fantastic. So I wish you all the luck in the world with those. And I hope everything goes all right for you with the pre-release.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Andrew. It's been lovely having you here. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's it at this point. No, thank you for having me. And thank you for the fabulous questions. And I'm looking forward to being able to spread the word about the episode.